Hi, I'm Jamie Metsala, a psychologist and professor at Mount St. Vincent University in Nova Scotia, Canada.
Hi, and I'm Alicia Smith. I'm the president of the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association. Welcome to this session, Honoring Every Child's Right to Read, Science-Informed Solutions. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Firstly, if you have any questions during the session, I encourage you to ask them as they come up. You can send those over to us by selecting the Q&A button on your screen and inputting your questions into the window. We'll be responding in real time. Secondly, please note that you'll have access to this session on demand through the conference portal for the next year. And finally, this session has also been closed captioned. You can turn on this feature in the bottom right corner of the media player. In Canada, we recognize that every child has the right to an education and that learning to read is a fundamental part of that education. This was confirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2012 in the Moore decision, and again recently by the Ontario Human Rights Commission when they launched the Right to Read public inquiry. They're looking to see if every child in Ontario has equitable and meaningful access to literacy through the instruction that they receive at school. But you might ask, in 2020, with so many other issues of equity going on, why are we focusing on reading? Well, I can tell you, it's because the long-term outcomes for people with low literacy skills are not great. These individuals are at a much higher risk of experiencing under and unemployment, poverty and homelessness, having physical and mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, or issues with addiction. They're also at a greater risk for incarceration and even suicide. So clearly, reading is an important social justice issue. Now, you might think as well that in Canada, a country with a very strong public education system, that we are making sure that children meet their reading expectations, that they are able to become literate in our public education system. And for many children, this is true. However, if you look at the data year after year, there is a significant portion of children who continue to struggle with literacy. When we look at the grade through 3 EQAO reading assessment results, we see that 1 out of 3 children are unable to pass this assessment unassisted. This is data from last year, 2018-2019. And again, these students continue to struggle when we look at the literacy skills of our incoming college and university students in Ontario. This is a study from the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario that found in 2016, again, 1 out of 3 incoming college and university students lacked the basic standard of literacy that the OECD considers necessary to be able to fully function and perform in today's economy. So we still have a lot to do when it comes to guaranteeing every student's right to read in Ontario. So who are these students and why are they experiencing difficulties? So we know that there are a lot of factors at play when it comes to risk for low literacy outcomes. And these factors include socioeconomic status. We know that children who are English language learners are at a higher risk of low literacy outcomes, as well as racialized students or students from certain minority groups. Also, students with language difficulties or learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, are at a much greater risk for reading failure. So I became interested in this issue because my own son is one of these 1 in 3 children. He really struggled with early literacy skills despite a lot of support at home. And he later went on to be diagnosed with dyslexia. And this is when I discovered the International Dyslexia Association, specifically the Ontario branch. And I started to learn not only about dyslexia, but also about this entire body of science that people are referring to now as the science of reading. This is a lot of information that has been discovered over the last 20, 30 years about not only how we read, but how we learn to read, why people struggle with reading, and what we can do to help them so that they can become successful with literacy. And this information was not only vitally important for me in trying to help my own son, But also, it was just fascinating. It's really interesting. And it's also exciting because I can see that if we can bring this information put it into the hands of teachers and get it into our education system, that we could maybe start to shrink that 1 in 3 children and make sure that more children are experiencing good literacy outcomes. So this is why I'm so excited to have Jamie here with us today to help unpack the science for us, to try to get some of that knowledge into the hands of educators. And I just want to start by asking you, Jamie, am I being naive in thinking that we can do better with literacy? I know we've put a lot of money and effort into literacy education in the last 20 years. A lot has been done, and we've shrunk that number from, much greater amount of students down to 1 in 3. But can we make it even smaller? Could we get it down to 1 in 5 or 1 in 10? Or could we eliminate illiteracy altogether?
How to eradicate reading difficulties and illiteracy is certainly a critical question. And I must say that in Nova Scotia, we also have about 1 in 3 children who by grade 3 have not developed adequate reading skills. Louisa Moutz, I think, answers your question best. She says, this we know, reading failure can be prevented in all but a small percentage of children, and that we do this by following the significant body of research showing which practices are most effective. I'd like to introduce one model of reading to lay the groundwork for our discussion today, and that is the simple view of reading. This model delineates 2 skill sets that are necessary for understanding what we read. The first, decoding, refers to turning those sequences of printed letters on the page into words. The second skill set refers to oral language comprehension. We need to understand those words and the sentences that help provide meaning. So for good reading comprehension to happen, both skill sets are necessary. Neither is sufficient on its own. Let's look at these 2 sentences to further illustrate each aspect of the simple view of reading. This first sentence is written in Morse code, and without adequate knowledge of what the dashes and dots represent, we cannot decode the sentence, and this totally impedes comprehending the message. For this second example, I can decode the title of this article, yet I cannot comprehend it. I do not have the conceptual vocabulary to understand this sentence. And by the way, the Morse code says reading is a complex cognitive activity. Today, I focus on the area of learning to decode or to read words, and it's really been a focus of a lot of research. I'm going to talk about what we know about skilled readers, what does learning the code entail, as well as what does the research tell us about these best instructional practices for preventing later reading difficulties or for intervening with older children who struggle to learn how to read. The goal of skilled reading is understanding texts. And in skilled readers, word reading is accurate, quick, and automatic. It takes up very little of our attention. And this is important because we then have our attention left to focus on the meaning-making task of the text. And so this becomes the goal for early readers, accurate and quick, or what we call automatic word recognition. So how do beginning readers learn to read words efficiently? Beginning readers learn this through sounding out words. By sounding out a word, it's a process that makes one fully analyze the letter sound associations within a word. And after doing this several times, our brain comes to store a representation of the letter sequences in that word associated with the pronunciation and meaning of that word. That word becomes what we call a sight word. So Linnea Airy called this process of our brain linking the visual letters on a page with the pronunciation meaning of a word as orthographic mapping. So our brains are quite amazing, and with accurate, intentional sounding out practice, our brains learn these individual sight words, but they also learn the statistical regularities of our system. So for example, if you've learned several or many words with the CY pattern, when you see a new word like cyber, you will know that C is going to represent the S sound rather than the K sound, which we see in other words. So it's really amazing that our brain is learning these statistical regularities of the system, and David Scher called this the self-teaching mechanism. The more beginning readers have learned those sound symbol associations and learn them to effectively sound out words, our brain starts building these connections. So now that we have discussed what our brains are doing that allows us to read words accurately and quickly, let's talk about the role of instruction. I want to start off by addressing some common myths about literacy education. One pervasive myth is that children learn to read naturally, similar to the way very young children learn to speak. From a very young age, children are immersed in the spoken language of their home, and without, for the most part, direct intentional instruction, they learn that spoken language. For literacy, it's often thought that immersion in books and being read to by a parent or teacher would be all that is needed for children to become readers. However, we know this analogy is not accurate. One way this is illustrated is by the fact that most all children learn to speak, whereas many children fail to learn to read without direct and explicit instruction. Another myth is that skilled readers rely on meaning and sentence structure to read words. That we hypothesize what the next word is in a sentence and really just need to skim the print to confirm these hypotheses. One of the most robust findings in cognitive science proves that this is not how good readers read. And as I've just explained, skilled readers have become so familiar with the sequences of letters and words and rely on this knowledge to read words, thus not interfering with our focus on comprehension. This myth, however, has led to instructional approaches that do not help children become good readers. These approaches promote using multiple cues to guess at words. For example, directing children to look at the picture to guess at what an unknown word might be, or to think about what word makes sense next in the sentence. And sounding out words is thought of almost as a last resort when the other cues are not effective. So such cueing system approaches are frequently written right into our curriculum in education systems and are often promoted in some of the most frequently used classroom and remedial literacy programs. So what do we know about classroom instruction that is best for all children, and it's essential for the many children that aren't succeeding to learn how to read adequately by first, second, and third grade? What we know is that we need direct and explicit systematic instruction in the components of word reading. And these components include phonemic awareness, which is our ability to access and manipulate those smallest sounds in words. So for example, if you hear the word shell, can you segment it into its individual phonemes? Sh, a, l. Conversely, if you hear the individual phonemes, can you blend those together to make the word shell? as well, learning those sound letter associations. First, we learn what are the most frequent sounds represented by the letters. So the S makes the S sound, SH, sh, and the vowel sounds, which can be really tricky as there are multiple vowel sounds that can be made. But we first learn the most frequent sound represented by a letter. We not only need that knowledge, but we need to be able to use that knowledge to sound out words so that our brain can engage in that orthographic mapping and learning the regularities of our print system. So a little bit later and more advanced, we also need to learn the structure of more complex words. We need to learn about morphemes, that's suffixes and root words. We need to learn about syllable types. And this type of instruction, this approach, is outlined in structured literacy approaches. And there are some good articles on that on the Unbita website. What's really important is that these components need to be taught in an explicit and direct manner. What does this mean? It means that we need to teach the knowledge and skills directly. We need to give elaborated explanations, ample examples, supported and independent practice, as well as cumulative review. The instruction also needs to be systematic. And this means that one teaches the whole system from the simplest to the most difficult concepts. And everyone has the skills when we teach in this manner to keep up with our daily instruction because everything they need to learn before has been taught to them and they've had a chance to become competent with those skills and knowledge. So I'm really excited to share some Canadian research on the outcomes when we put such good instruction in classrooms for young students. The first study I'm going to tell you about is by Dr. George Yu from the University of Alberta. And this study had 290 students who were in mid-grade 1 at the time, and those students scored the lowest on pre-reading and early reading tests, and they were across 11 different schools. The intervention itself was quite short, 10 weeks for approximately 15 hours in total in small groups. And the components were those that I just spoke about, the blending, segmenting phonemes, letter sound associations, and using those to read words and decoding lots of words in children's texts. The outcomes from that study was that by the end of the intervention, all but 7 children had caught up to their peers. And so that leaves us with a rate of 1% of the population who is behind their peers and not reading adequately at that point. Another study that I'd like to speak about is from the North Vancouver School District with Linda Siegel's the lead researcher. And this focus was really on the classroom instruction. So all kindergarten teachers across 30 schools and 1,000 students used a phonemic awareness program that focused on phonemic awareness as well as sound letter associations. About 20% of the population were learning English as a second language. And you can see that there are children who came in with skills that were low and they were at risk of not catching up to their peers and not learning to read adequately. Outcomes in grade 2 showed that only about 2 to 3% of the students were not reading adequately in grade 2. So that's much lower than we see when this type of instruction isn't used. Furthermore, these students were followed through to grades 4 and 7 with the same amazing results. Only 2 to 3% of those students still could not read words as well as their peers. They would be classified as students who had dyslexia. So we have lots of research out of the US showing these same results when these best practices are implemented. So we know that children may come to school in kindergarten, grade 1, at risk for reading failure for many different factors. They can be related to environmental factors, to neurobiological factors, but regardless, we can prevent later reading difficulties in all but a very small proportion of the population. So I'm going to go on and talk about those interventions for students who are older but still struggling to learn to adequately read words quickly and accurately. And those are students we may say are diagnosed with dyslexia, or also those who are undiagnosed but have difficulty in this area of reading and spelling words. I'm going to tell you about one study that looked at the Spell Read program. This is an intervention developed in Prince Edward Island by Kay McPhee. The full program is about 120 hours. So what we know about interventions, it's the same elements, but they need to be more explicit, more systematic, more intense, and lengthier. They need to work both on skill accuracy and skill efficiency. In the study that I did with my colleague, Margaret David, we looked at 65 children. At the beginning of the program, they were their mean age was 9 years, 3 months. It went up all the way to 16 years of age. They were well below average on their word reading as well as on their reading fluency, which takes into account both accuracy and reading rate. So we can see here that the students in the first 40 hours shot way up on their percentage correct on a test of phonological awareness and on the number of sound letter associations that they knew. We can see in this slide that the students also came up into the average range on word reading at that 80 hours mark and continued to improve by 120 hours. So we can say that these students closed the gap with their peers in word reading. In terms of reading comprehension, that too, these students closed the gap with their peers. Once they were able to read words efficiently, they could use their good language comprehension to understand what they were reading. When we look at fluency, the students ended at 120 hours, and even by 80 hours, they were reading much more accurately and much more quickly than they had been at the beginning of the program. However, we have not completely closed that gap in fluency, and that's an area that research is still investigating to find out how we can do that better. What does this mean for individual children who get effective programs and those who don't get effective interventions? So I've just put up the reading profiles of two students that I've worked with, Jane and John, who both at mid-grade 2 were well below average on their word reading and their reading comprehension. Jane was enrolled in a private clinic with the Spell Read program, and after 80 hours, over a year, she was reading much better. Her word reading came into the average range. Her reading comprehension was above average. That fluency, however, was still below average. She did get quicker, but she didn't come into the average range. She will have 40 more hours of that intervention to keep working on that fluency. John, after mid-grade 2, had been in resource classes until grade 6 when he was reassessed. And the resource classes could not provide the systematic, explicit, direct program that was needed to help John's word reading. So that remained below average, and his reading comprehension remained well below average. And that was despite his vocabulary and verbal reasoning being above average, as were Jane's in grade 2. So this also comes along with other difficulties by grade 6. Students' social emotional well-being is certainly affected when they fail to learn to read, as well as just their self-concept. So Dr. Moats, at the end of that paragraph, states that the tragedy here is that most reading failure is unnecessary. And we've seen that in the examples and the type of instructional approach that I've shown you today, what can happen. So we know that word reading difficulties can be prevented in all but a very small percentage of children. Without these instructional approaches, we know that about 30% of early elementary students will fail to learn to read adequately, and these students do not catch up. They will remain to have these reading deficits that will impact their academic success and social emotional well-being. Given this large percentage of students that need help just in this one area, our remedial resources are overwhelmed. We also know that remediation, rather than prevention, is more intense, it takes more time, there's a larger skill gap to be made up, and it's extremely hard to close that gap in reading fluency. We also know later it's much more costly. So I just want to close by saying that of course there are other very important elements that need to be taught in early literacy classrooms. We can, however, have one focus, and it's essential, on phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency, but we don't need to take away from the other elements that still need to be part of a complete literacy program. So Alicia, I've talked about the science of reading acquisition and the science of reading instruction. What do you think needs to happen to see the system-wide changes that would support all children learning to read?
Well, changing the education system is certainly no easy feat. There's so many different players involved, and there's a lot of interest. There are a lot of teachers and administrators who are really interested in seeing this change, especially the ones who've had children themselves who have struggled and have gone out and sought this body of information and used it to help their own child and then brought it back into their classrooms. Those are the most passionate advocates for system change that I am working with today. They love it. But for system change to really be effective, we need to start at the top. And it's such a complicated system. IDA Ontario, along with many other advocacy organizations, have been trying for years to try a breakthrough at those higher levels, at the ministry level, the Ontario College of Teachers level. And it's very, very difficult, which is why about 2.5 years ago, several groups banded together and started to work together and started to approach this through the lens of human rights. We approached the Ontario Human Rights Commission and laid out this case that because we don't have evidence-based instruction embedded in our curriculum, and it's not available to every child in every school, many children are having their human rights violated because they're not able to access the instruction that they need, either through their classroom or through remediation programs. So I think that if we are going to see system change in education, we really need to start with the curriculum, because that's the document that guides everything in education. It's what informs teacher training, the choice of instructional materials in the classroom, like the actual books the kids are going to read, the assessments that are being used to measure a student's progress, and the reporting, the way that the student's progress is being communicated to the parents. So often parents are unaware of the real literacy difficulties that their child is having, because our curriculum is not really, doesn't have a lot of specific goals for children.
We have a lot of those same issues here in Nova Scotia. Maybe you could tell me, what would you want to see specifically in a curriculum that would, again, support these changes?
Thank you. Well, I think that I would love to see a curriculum that is much more like the curriculum that they have in England, which is a new curriculum that was brought in about 2011, 2012, I believe. And that curriculum is based on the simple view of reading. So they've taken word recognition, and then they've taken the comprehension piece and they've separated them, and they've made specific and measurable goals for each one of those foundational literacy skills that you outlined in your presentation. So I would love to see that. I would also love to see a curriculum that is based in the science of reading. Currently, our curriculum still has as the strategy that children will use to read words, cueing. So it's teaching children to use those cueing strategies. That's written right into our curriculum. And because that's there, we still have entire classroom literacy programs that are built around cueing instead of built around teaching decoding systematically. So really what we're looking for is something that is in line with the science and contains specific and measurable expectations so that we can track students' progress all the way along. So those literacy expectations are being measured, and then they're also being communicated back to parents so that those red flags are popping up right at the beginning. When a kid in grade 1 is struggling with those foundational skills, we need to know that so we can help them.
For sure, those are all excellent points, and I hope that we see those changes coming in recommendations from the inquiry and reaching right across Canada.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Jamie, for helping everyone understand the science of reading.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Alicia. And I wonder now if at home people have questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, Jamie and I will be in the background on the chat for the next 10 minutes. So use your chat function located at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you have.